most of you have probably seen some, if not all, of this presentation, just in different formats. I'm doing a lot of it. I'm thinking about changing the title from community development to community revitalization, because that's really what is going on. We're in about year 5 of what I think is a 10-year, really big sweeping change in Hamilton. Things are changing for the better. The things we'd hoped we could do, the small successes have happened, and now we're starting to see medium and large successes. So it's a momentum that I think is really important for a city like Hamilton. I want to unpack it a little, though, and talk about, especially for all of us that kind of grew up in towns like this, you know, what is it that we have and why are we revitalizing it, and why is it different than other places that you might go to? Hamilton is actually a pretty extreme city in terms of its industrial wealth that it created around 1860 to 1900. And there's a reason for that that most people don't understand, and it is we were, before electric power was available widely for industry, we had hydraulic power. So people think of the river as one of our most important assets, and they are absolutely right. But it wasn't just the water in the river for drinking purposes or for making paper that was valuable. It was the fact that north of the city, out by about where Camel Guard is, the river's 23 feet higher than right in front of the city through downtown. So the engineers of the day came up with a brilliant idea to channel that water through canals through the city, and as you channeled it past places that went back to the river, the fall of the river was hydraulic power. It turned turbines that made very large factories work before there was any electric. So places like Detroit, you know, those grew up in the era after there was electric power, but places like Hamilton really were 1845, the first hydraulic opened. So we had a 50-year jump on most cities relative to an industrial power source. And so companies like this, gone now, Niles Tool Works, this was the largest tool and die works company in the planet Earth. It wasn't the biggest one in Midwest, it wasn't the biggest one in Ohio or in America, it was the biggest one in the world. A lot of German immigrants came to Hamilton, Ohio to work in places like this because the Germans sort of launched the tool and die industry in the world, but real quickly places in the United States, because of raw materials and because of power like we had, hydraulic power, became the places where it happened. So I'm a 4th generation German immigrant to Hamilton. These guys are 5th generation German immigrants. My great-grandfathers, their great-great-grandfathers came here to work in these kinds of places. So there was tool and die, there was paper making. Another value of water is it takes enormous amounts of water to make paper. And so paper making became, again, big deal in Hamilton, Ohio. And at the time, about the 30s and 40s, Champion Paper was the largest paper manufacturing company in the world. Again, not just in the United States or in Ohio, but in the world. And on top of that were other companies like Beckett Paper. And so we had broad industries. And then we had the industries that supported the industries. Black Clawson made paper-making machines. And the Schuler-Benninghofen mills made woolen felts that the paper laid out on and was made on. So at one point in time, Hamilton was the city that made everything it needed, and everything it needed to make those things it made. It was a really, really self-contained, powerful city. And so what's all that mean for what we're talking about today? It means that this river is really important as an asset to us, but it means that we had a built environment that was fueled by massive wealth from our industrial base. Very few cities, not Dayton, not Cincinnati, had the kind of wealth between 1850 and 1900 that Hamilton had. So what was built, the churches, the office buildings, the housing stock, the streets and sewers, they were all built off the basis of enormous wealth, and they're all still here. We didn't do what some cities in the Midwest did, and we didn't demolish a lot of our built assets. So those built assets are valuable. But over time, as the industries dried up and they left and we became what people call a Rust Belt city, things changed. And you guys aren't old enough to remember this, but in the late 90s, the front of the Robinson Twin building looked like this. We covered our buildings up with simple materials to make them last longer. We covered them up with simple materials to make them look more modern, because old style architecture wasn't modern in terms of the 50s and 60s rush towards what we call mid-century modernism. So people have just started to understand that the stuff behind the screens is really valuable and really a big asset for a city like Hamilton. And so we started uncovering those assets. This is Ryan's Taverns just 6-7 years ago. Again, covered up with some pretty horrible modernization materials, pulled back off and restored. It's a great building. And so We've had some early successes with downtown revival, but most cities still weren't believing that it was possible. And to be fair, most cities weren't figuring out how to do it financially. It doesn't make sense on paper to put the kind of money you have to put in these old buildings to make them useful again. And so it was the basis of faith. People like Don Ryan and Larry and Carla Fear did these buildings, and not because they made sense on paper, because it made sense because they believed in their communities. So it was kind of a faith-based jump. And then we got to some more projects that actually came to us from outside of the city. Both of these projects were not local developers. They were out-of-town developers, Mercantile Lofts and ArtSpace. Good things they showed us. They showed us, A, that large-scale projects were possible. They also showed us what kind of creative tools, like tax credits, you could bring to town to make projects like this make sense on paper. Because frankly, these guys weren't coming to town just because they believed in Hamilton, and they certainly weren't coming to town to lose money. So it had to be a money-making proposition, or at least a break-even proposition for these kinds of projects to work. So how do those look? This is a project that is $11.1 million. I remember the bankers telling these guys, why would you invest $11.1 million in a bunch of buildings that are falling down? Why would you do that? Well, they showed us why. They showed us that the value of the buildings really drives the marketability of the buildings. People want to live here not just because it's in downtown Hamilton, and not just because it's new apartments, but because they're very different from the kind of apartments you can rent on the outskirts of town or in Springdale or in Westchester, because they're based on the old, again, industrial wealth fabric that the city of Hamilton built. So when we first looked at moving our office into this building, you went into what is the front door of our office, and this is what you saw. The roof was in the basement. Everything that was on the ceiling, everything that was on the floor was in the basement in piles. And so the city of Hamilton had actually been asked to issue a demolition permit on these buildings. And they didn't do that because they wanted them to be saved. So the city, instead of issuing the demolition permit, bought the buildings. The planning department bought the buildings and said, we have to find a developer who knows how to work with this kind of building stock. And they did. And so they went into this building and they literally unpacked the basement from all the ceiling tile, all the floor material, the wood flooring patterns. You can see wood floor up in here that was hanging on the edge, falling in. And they put it back together. And this was not cheap, but this was done through historic tax credits. And it says historic fabric that's this valuable, you get tax credits to actually put money into these projects to make them make sense on paper. There was about $3 million that went into these buildings that didn't come out of the developer's pocket. It came out of tax credits. And that made this building make sense. The next part that people thought didn't make sense is no one wants to live here. Who wants to live in downtown Hamilton? Well, that's changing. The millennials are saying we want to live closer to where we work. We want to live and not have the cost of long-distance travel in cars. We don't want the cost of huge lawns to maintain. We want to live where there's action, where there's live, work, and play going on. And so these apartments rented up within 6 months. Most apartment buildings might take 3 years to fill their occupancy. These went enormously fast. And in an era where the banks, or even the banks in Hamilton, said, no one's going to want to live there. You're going to have a nice project, and certainly you do, but it's not going to ever generate rent. Today, this building generates $85,000 a month in rent. So it's working on paper for these developers, and nobody believed it, not even the banks. So there's commercial spaces, like this is our office, retail spaces, like Art Off Sims, and Milliken & Fitton's law office is in the front of this building in the commercial section of it. But there also is a lot of residential, 29 units that have, again, been filled since the first 6 months we opened. Another project that existed behind a modern screen for decades. Again, terrible building inside, bad condition. People said there's no way this makes sense on paper to do. ArtSpace is a lot like the Mercantile developers. This is a $10.2 million project, another stunning number that people were saying, why would you do that? But they use not only historic tax credits, they use housing tax credits. Housing tax credits allows for people with lower incomes to be able to have a subsidized rent, much cheaper rent, in buildings like this. And so they also market that subsidized rent to a particular part of the demographic, and it's artists. So these were marketed to artists as live-work units where you can actually do your art and live about half the market rate of rent. And so to do that, again, about 80% of this project is funded by tax credits, and only 20% is funded by ArtSpace. So it's a huge deal on paper because it works because of those tools. So we looked for the old drawings of how this building was supposed to look. We found them. We decided we would restore that to that condition. We weren't sure what we'd find. We also saw in the drawings there was oak and maple floors. There was historic tin ceilings. There were huge windows. that used to be pivot operating, all kinds of things that have long since sort of been disappeared, we thought, in this building. They were covered over with years of carpet and linoleum and ceiling tiles that didn't belong in the air of this building. So we imagined this project being redone and reoccupied. And as we tore into it, we got permission from the state of Ohio to put new windows. We got the city of Hamilton to vacate some of the property to this side. So when we created all these live-work units in what was an old department store, we would have lots of places where people wanted to live with outdoor light and windows and ventilation. So then as we tore into the building and got the ugly stuff off, we found the old floors were still there. The old ceilings were still there. These buildings have historic fabric that, again, were built by a department store that had the kind of wealth that could put this together. Those don't exist anymore today. But the pieces and parts that they created existed. We actually found this cast iron stair in the middle of a drywall shaft that had been closed in on all sides for 50 years. No one even knew that stair was still in the building. It was showed up on the original drawing, so we started digging into the drywall to find that behind it, this stair was still there. So it's kind of the centerpiece of the resident entry into the building now. So it's the historic elements of this building that I think make it more desirable to live in than another building. This is and you remember this is how this building looked just 3 years ago. The screen was on it. It was the most modern office building in the city of Hamilton, quote unquote, in 1969. And now it's going back to the way it was intended to be. So just a week ago, we've got the scaffolding down, and we're about 90% done with returning that building to the way it was supposed to be. And again, the demand for renting these apartments has been off the charts. I think they already have it half rented before it even opens. And so the idea that people don't want to live downtown is no longer a believable fact, because the fact is the demand is high. Another really interesting project. Again, we were having huge success with downtown housing, thinking this is the way we're going to go. We came across Journal News, Cox Publishing, saying we're going to be done with our building in downtown Hamilton. We've consolidated all of the Journal News operations to our printing presses in Dayton and our office buildings out in Westchester. We have no longer a need for this building. We're just going to let it go dark. We said, well, you know what happens when you do that? The building sits there and decays. The parking lots across the street that you own become the more valuable piece of this, and so people buy these buildings, leave them empty, and they rent out the parking spaces that are a little more valuable than the building. So Cox Publishing did a great thing. They said, we will not sell this building. We will not do anything with it until the city of Hamilton has a chance to decide if they can bring players to the table to make it work. So between the city and Cox, we got control of this building, the same developers as the Mercantile, but it wasn't going to be a residential kind of property. It was just a different kind of building than that. It was an industrial building and an office building, and not really well suited for residential. Here's a historic picture of it in the 30s. This part of the building actually goes back to about 1896. This has always been a newspaper building since the day it was built 110 years ago, 120 years ago. Inside the ancient pictures, again, it was kind of encouraging. We saw these herringbone maple floors. We saw some interesting modern elements in the building, the huge windows made of really heavy-duty aluminum, some good things. We weren't sure that was all there, but we had an idea that this was going to be something different than residential. So we had, actually, I had taken a trip to Austin, Texas, and they had turned an old big box like Kroger store into this ballet company's home. It took a little bit of money. It's in a bad part of town, but it's actually turned that part of town around. And so I brought that idea back to the city and said, what if we were to put artistic endeavors in here? And our first idea was to put Miami Valley Ballet in here, and they are in here, but that was only going to use a small part of the building. So pretty soon we reached out to Butler County, or Butler Tech School of the Arts, who was looking for a new home, and we were able to imagine the whole building being filled. How long ago was this?
4 years.
4 years ago? This is the printing press room where the printing press printed the papers every day for the Journal News for about 50 years. And today it's dance studios for Miami Valley Ballet. Big change. What's the big change? Not only is this building not dark, and not only is the parking lot across the street not the most valuable piece, we got back to the historic finishes. We put 180 School of the Arts students here, about 130 Miami Valley Ballet students here. This building makes people go in and out and around downtown. That's the big game changer. It's not that this building has an occupant, it's that this building is generating traffic downtown that's valuable to every business downtown, every restaurant, every coffee shop, every retail outlet. Everything you want to see downtown is young creative people moving about, and that's what's happened. So what used to be, again, storage rooms for paper rolls are now classrooms for Butler Tech, art studios. This is their art and 2D arts and 3D art studio as well. And again, these are the people that make a difference downtown, not the building. It's the occupants. And it's a big deal. I think my battery's dying in this. So another reclamation of a building, not housing. And now we've got a momentum. Now we've got 3 really good-sized projects under our belt. In the city manager, Joshua Smith, says, we got to continue this. And the problem with continuing it was we didn't have the money to do it. We didn't have the developers in line to do it. We didn't have the design team in mind to do it. We didn't have the sort of city rules to do it. So the city created the Hamilton Core Fund, and it stands for Consortium for Ongoing Reinvestment Efforts. It's a nonprofit private redevelopment agency. It's kind of a private arm that avoids some of the difficulties of public organizations from doing the kind of things we want to do. Our investors are the Community Foundation, First Financial Bank, U.S. Bank, and the City of Hamilton. And we're about a $9.5 million fund right now, and it's very active and very engaged in property. Our biggest efforts have been around what's on the left there, the Strategic Property Fund. That's buying old buildings that are sitting empty and not being reused and trying to figure out a way to change that. So here's an example of a building. Ugly, boarded up, modernized again in the 60s. Something that I kind of took for granted. Drove by it every day, kind of got used to it. Every once in a while you'd gaze up and say, man, this was a pretty cool building at one time. Why is that? So we took it apart. We bought the building. We took it apart. It's not a big building. It wasn't going to create 50 jobs or put a new school of the arts in it. It wasn't going to create housing for 50 people or 20 people. It would create housing maybe for 2 or 3 families at best. But it was still an important building. It was a bookend at the edge of the street. And so we put it back together completely. Probably spent a little more money than it's worth in terms of its sale value, but it has changed the entire block. And in fact, this building next to it has been for sale for 5.5, 6 years. And the day we finished this building and opened up a new retail in the front of that building sold for the price he was been asking for 5.5 years. So the impact of this building isn't the building itself, it's the impact on the block in the downtown. And this is our smallest project from a dollar standpoint and a square footage standpoint, but it's probably our most impactful project because people noticed how much difference a little tiny project like this made in the whole block. It got people that own buildings all up and down High Street to start rethinking what they're doing and whether they should leave them sitting in neutral the way they are. And so the before and after is shocking. And again, that's what Hamilton built out of its industrial wealth. That's what it's become in the last 50 years, and we're trying to get it back. So inside, we didn't plan on having a tenant. We just planned on fixing up the building. And again, right about the time we were starting to finish, Sarah Vallandigham, who had a store out in Bridgewater Falls, where you think that's the perfect place for a store. That's where the traffic is. That's where all the people shop. Why would someone want to come to Hamilton? She said, I want to be in a downtown environment. I want to be where there's more drive-by traffic to my store than there is in Bridgewater Falls. And she came here, and the astonishing part is she says she's doing way better here financially with her sales than she was doing in Bridgewater Falls. That's amazing. And to have the ability for downtown Hamilton to compete with Bridgewater Falls in terms of a retail destination is huge. And you know, Butler County is building one of the biggest shopping centers in this part of the state out at Liberty Town Center, and they're building it out of this kind of building model. They're building 2- and 3-story looking buildings. They're trying to make it look and feel like a downtown. It's exactly what we have in downtown Hamilton. So huge change, big impact, big catalytic impact on the whole block. So these are the things the Core Fund's doing. We're being intentional. Used to be you could wait for anybody with money to be opportunistic. When something was needed to be done, somebody had money, they made it happen. Those days are over. We also loan money to projects. We use public dollars and private dollars, which is something, again, that's a huge trend right now because there's not enough on either side of the line to make things work. But when you put it together, it works great. And our biggest reason for existence is controlling property. And this is the big story, the Elder Beerman building. The guy that owned this building lived in Long Island, New York. He owns 800 buildings like this around the country. He's a billionaire. He doesn't think about the Elder Beerman store in Hamilton at all. Somebody pays the utilities and pays the property taxes, and he doesn't think about it. He just has a giant portfolio of buildings. So when we had people come to us and say, we have an idea, we'd like to take some space in Elder Beerman, we would say, well, you got to call this guy in Long Island. They would try. 3 months later, they come back to us and said, we gave up. We couldn't get a hold of this guy. Nothing was happening. So we bought this building, and people said, what are you thinking? We paid like $500,000 for the building, and we certainly, and then right away we inherited the property taxes and the roof leaks and the sidewalk conditions, and anything that was wrong with this building became our problem. And people said, that's crazy. But what wasn't crazy is when the next guy came along with an idea about using a piece or all of this building, we had it in a place where we could actually do business with them. We could make it happen. So first thing we did was imagine how the building could be used differently. Because the idea of finding another big department store like Macy's or Elder Beerman or anybody to come into small towns like Hamilton, those days don't work on paper for the retail people anymore either. So we imagined that a new Elder Beerman or a new Target or a new Macy's wasn't coming to Hamilton. We tried, but it just didn't seem practical. So then we started looking at it differently. We took the building apart and made it fit in parts and pieces. We cleaned out all of the old store fixtures. We made it look more like a brand new dark shell, we call it in the retail trade. This is a building ready for redevelopment. It sits here, has structure, has sprinklers, has everything it needs. We just need to build out the interior for a tenant and find the tenants. And so we thought that was going to be a long, slow, patient, maybe crazy proposition to do that. But as it's turned out, we're looking already at 5 new tenants in this building. Kettering Health Network came to us as our first tenant saying, we've seen in other places in the country where they've taken old big boxes and they've turned them into health centers. And we said, we have too. In fact, this looks a lot like Elder Beerman to me. That's why I flipped the picture, because it almost has the same overhang representation that the Elder Beerman building has. So we looked at some of these facilities around the country, and we worked out a way to make Kettering our first tenant, both with a diabetes education center and a primary care physician's office. Right away after we found Kettering, we found a couple who wanted to open a downtown grocery because of all the new residential demand. And we found Butler County DD wanted a place to sell all the artwork that their studio makes because it's become so popular. Now they're going to places to actually create an income stream for their studio out of selling the artwork. So really quickly, we had 4 decent-sized tenants, and we were very happy about doing this project this summer. And we are doing this project this summer. But in the meantime, when all these people announced they were going into the High Street level of Elder Beerman, we landed a full-floor tenant, 40,000 square foot call center. That's cool. It's 40,000 square feet. It's a lot of money. It helps light up this Elder Beerman building. But the really cool part about it is it's 700 new jobs and 700 new people walking around downtown, going to restaurants, going to groceries, going to bars, going to shop at Sarah's house and Art Sims. It's a game changer when you can put that many new jobs in downtown Hamilton. It's also $3 million a year to Hamilton's general fund through the income tax. So this is what we'd hoped for. It's what we imagined could happen. We had no idea it would happen this soon or this well. So the image of the core fund, re-teeing up, resetting buildings and finding reuses for them was our goal, and this is a perfect example of it working on a large scale. That's the DD class who's coming to their new space in about 6 months. And these are examples we looked at of downtown markets. We're not talking about convenience stores with cigarettes and lottery tickets and beef jerky. We're talking about real downtown groceries with fresh fruit, fresh breads, fresh produce, farm-to-table kind of things. And that's going to be in downtown Hamilton. So very cool for the residents. We're also going to reset the entire exterior of the building because of the new tenants we have. We have the funds to be able to make that happen. So it's going to be a very different looking building, and it's going to have all kinds of new people coming in and out on a daily basis. I put this one in twice, so I'm going to skip through this. I thought it was missing. It just got replaced. So let's sort of end talking about this block of Hamilton. In 2010, when I took this picture, no, this is actually later, but in 2010, when we came to look for office space in this building, this is 200,000 square feet of building. There was one tenant in this whole block. It's this attorney right here, John Nuremberg. He had a 2,000 square foot space in a 200,000 square foot block. So in 2010, there's 1% occupancy on this block. In downtown Hamilton, in the center of Hamilton, Ohio, there's 1% occupancy. This is what the building all looked like at turn of the century. Fantastic building stock, every storefront, every office space, every apartment full to the brim. And this is what we started with in 2010. And this is where we are in 2015. By the end of this year, this block, all 200,000 square feet of it, will be 100% occupied. That's 100% vacant, or 0% vacancy from 99% vacancy in a 5-year period. That's what revitalization is all about, changing that. So when we talk to other cities and other economic development agencies and other government agencies about going from 1% occupancy to 100% occupancy in 5 years, they have no idea how that happened. And I'm not here to tell you that I made it happen or any one person made it happen, but the city is focused on making that happen, and that's a huge story to tell anywhere. I don't care what city if you're in. This is good news for Boston or New York or Chicago, and it's great news for a city like Hamilton. So to us, that's the real story to tell, is that we're changing the downtown by little steps, but huge accomplishment over when you put them all together over a 5-year period. So I think 5 years from now, we're going to be talking about a lot of new stuff in Hamilton. So I'll answer questions or let you move on to your agenda, because that's probably a little long.
Thank you for coming. Does anybody have any questions?
Who's ready to move downtown?
Yeah, really.
In your first apartment?
Has everybody seen the buildings, all the changes that have been happening downtown? Have you noticed? Have you been into Sarah's house, the shop here?